All right, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we are here to release our fantastic new report. Well, I say that, but I obviously have a stake in this, on a national strategy for machine intelligence for the United States. My name is Will Carter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tech Policy Program here at CSIS. And I authored this report along with my wonderful colleagues from Booz Allen, Emma Knukin and Josh Elliott. And we're very excited to have you here today. As a little bit of background, we will be discussing some of the findings of the report and the way that we thought about this project first. Then we'll have some responses from some of our panelists, go through a couple of key questions that arose in the course of the research. And then we'll turn it over to you all for Q&A. So hope you have some questions lined up for us. So to kick off, I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this report. So this report came out of a piece that Emma and I wrote that was published in The Atlantic a few months ago, highlighting the need for a comprehensive strategy for the US government to address machine intelligence. The US in some ways actually started the discussion globally around MI policy, particularly with the work done at the end of the Obama administration by the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House and also by the National Science and Technology Council. But we thought that there was more work to be done and that there was room to expand on those efforts and build on them to develop a really comprehensive national policy. So in setting up this strategy, we've tried to focus on how the US government can achieve two key goals. The first is to support the development of the technology and to support its deployment and adoption, but in a way that is safe, is responsible, and addresses the legitimate concerns that the technology will raise. And the second is to maintain US leadership. This is an area where the US is, for the first time, developing a new technology on the cutting edge of a technological evolution, but it is not alone. And that is not something that we've seen in recent years. And thinking about what role the US government can play in leading in this technology is really important. There are a few key themes that we wanted to highlight in developing this report. The first is that the debate in Washington around AI, we've tended to define AI and the need to think about it in a very narrow way. We focus on the GPUs, the graphics processing units built by companies like Nvidia that run AI. We think about the machine learning algorithms and the neural nets as AI, but we don't recognize the broader context, all of the other technologies that enable and are part of the ecosystem in which AI works. Particularly things like IoT, 5G. And we wanted to highlight the importance of recognizing this broader ecosystem and the role that MI plays in that ecosystem, but also how those technologies can help us to further our goals of this national strategy. The second key theme we wanted to highlight is the China question. So much of the debate in the US is focused on competing with China and with beating China in the race to AI. But we really felt that what's most important is for the US to capture the benefits of this technology, to help maximize the benefits of this technology both domestically and for the world. And as much as other countries are going to be a part of the development of this technology, the US needs to lead and needs to invest because this technology has huge potential implications for us. It's not about beating anyone. A third and important piece was to expand beyond R&D, which has really been where the discussion around the role that the US government can play has focused. The reports that were done at the end of the Obama administration emphasized R&D very heavily, and we did highlight the important role that the US government can play in supporting R&D, particularly filling the gaps where industry doesn't have clear incentives to invest. But we thought that there was more to it, and one of the key areas that we wanted to emphasize here was the importance of supporting adoption. Innovation has been a historic strength of the United States and something that we remain very good at and we continue to lead at. But adoption has been something that we have sometimes struggled with. And we wanted to think about how policy in this space can support adoption, can support and channel adoption into areas that provide a lot of leverage and that in ways that address some of the concerns around this technology. And finally, we did want to look at some of the legitimate concerns that come out of MI technology, but we wanted to do so while maybe putting to rest a little bit the, MI jobs apocalypse narrative or the great war with the machines that is surely imminent. I think we share a view that Americans tend to be very pessimistic about this technology. Maybe we watch too many dystopian movies. But this is a technology that has a lot of potential. It will create a lot of opportunity and a lot of growth. And we wanted to frame a slightly more positive narrative around this technology. So with that, I will briefly introduce you to our wonderful panelists. So on the far end over there is Ned Finkel. Ned is one of the leaders at Nvidia, where he is Vice President for External Relations. And Ned's company, Nvidia, is a leader in this technology. They are one of the first companies that recognize the potential of GPUs to support MI technologies. And they also are involved at all stages of the AI tech stack and doing really interesting work. Next to Ned is Josh Elliott, who is one of the co-authors on this report. Josh leads the machine intelligence business at Booz Allen, our wonderful partners on this project, and is really doing some of the fantastic work in this space. In the middle, we have Ken Anderson, who is a professor of law at American University and has been a really important leading voice in the discussion around law and regulation for machine intelligence. And then finally, I will pass it over to my colleague, Emma Knukin, who is a lead associate in the machine intelligence business at Booz Allen, has been a fantastic partner on this report, and he's going to give you a little bit more detail on some of the key topics that we covered and some of our findings.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Will, and good morning, everyone. Will did a great job introducing the report, so I'd like to just give some brief context for Booz Allen's participation in the creation of this paper and background as to why we are calling for greater policymaker and government participation in the machine intelligence discussion at this time. For the past several years, Booz Allen has been very deeply invested in creating and delivering machine intelligence technologies. And that experience has given us incredible insight into the potential that the technology has, from providing our armed forces greater capabilities and enhancing their resiliency and insight into threat environments, to enabling scientific researchers at our research institutions to create new discoveries that improve our health and our ability to protect the planet. Of course, the technology also has a more sinister side, which, to Will's point, is often very heavily covered. We were great admirers of a report that was released last week by about half a dozen academic institutions that outlined how machine intelligence technology could be used nefariously. There are also more mundane ways that the technology could cause problems or create questions for policymakers and government citizens, from questions over privacy and cybersecurity to questions around how the technology will change the nature of work. Booz Allen's unique position as both a developer of machine intelligence technologies and an advisor to the institutions that use it gives us a very unique perspective and vantage point. And that vantage point has allowed us to see that the technology is advancing incredibly rapidly, but deployment is still nascent. And we believe that the United States is really at a pivotal moment where new questions will arise around how the technology is implemented very quickly. The commercial sector has made very sincere efforts to, through the use of institutions like OpenAI and the Partnership on AI to Benefit People and Society, to explore some of the ethical and policy issues that will surround machine intelligence. But these efforts can't occur in isolation. Policymakers have unique levers of power, unique knowledge, and unique experience that will be critical to shaping the positive delivery of the technology. And so in writing this report, we really hope to provide a call to action for those leaders to become more involved in discussions with the commercial sector and with other research institutions on ensuring that machine intelligence is a net positive for society. We'll discuss in greater detail, I think, some of the details of the report, but if we could offer one recommendation to policymakers who are reading this, or one takeaway, it's that machine intelligence is a very broad area of study. There is an endless amount of information that you could learn. We recommend really thinking about the policy areas that you govern or the issues for your particular agency or institution, considering what the policy questions are that the technology will create, and becoming an expert in those as a first step to becoming a larger part of the conversation around the technology. And with that, I'll turn it back to Will.
Great. So I want to turn this over to our other co-panelists to get their perspectives on the report. Maybe we'll start with Josh,
Sure.
who is also a part of our team writing this report.
I think one of the biggest takeaways that I'll add, we outline a number of recommendations, policy-related recommendations in the report, but there's a lot of work that can be done today across government in terms of having and starting the conversation within each of your respective organizations and agencies. Things that you can do, counseling with actual industry and academic organizations to truly understand the impact to both society, but also the risks associated and opportunities associated with the new technology. I think this is an important thing that can be done today. It's not something that requires any kind of executive order and should be part of organizations' strategy conversations in terms of where they're moving and how they're starting to responsibly adopt this type of technology.
Ken?
So I come at this as a lawyer, which is a scary thought, but in a way it's kind of the next extension beyond the question of policy, because policy is implemented one way or another in conjunction with and with the support of regulations, laws, all of that kind of thing. And I think that the role of law in this is critical both for a coordinating function in terms of the different things that have to be mobilized together in order to enable adoption and not just technical innovation. And second, and I think this is emerging now in terms of the discussions around things like self-driving cars, is one of the important roles of law, regulation, the government's role, is to promote, say, in the case of self-driving cars, safety in such a way that it is both real and that it can be communicated to the public that they can actually trust the technologies to do what the technologies are promised to do. And that's something that to some degree industry, people outside government can do, but the Department of Transportation is going to carry a huge functional role in this, in putting a sort of seal of this stuff is safe to use, and that will be true across a lot of areas. I myself think that one of the critical dragons to slay in this is the dragon of the Terminator and Skynet and superintelligence, and I think it would be good if Elon Musk said less. And I have to say, Elon Musk in the legal space is at this moment coming forward and saying to legislators and lawmakers and regulators, you have to regulate this technology today, not for the safety concerns, for example, that are facing you immediately, or the ethical concerns and so on. You have to do it in order to avoid the apocalypse in some sci-fi imaginary future. That strikes me as being the worst possible regulatory approach, and it's exemplified by the company Tesla that, on the one hand, is talking about the AI apocalypse and the need to regulate against it, but on the other hand is also the company that put out this quasi-self-driving vehicle stuff that results in the first fatal accident. So you might think that maybe more attention to the safety protocols and the stuff that's directly in front of you would be a better approach. And the virtue is law and lawyers and regulators and all of that will deal with the problems that are most immediately in front of them. And I think that that is the right approach, and that in conjunction with a coordinating role can wind up enabling the adoption rather than simply the technical innovations in a vacuum.
Ned?
Thanks for inviting me also to be on the panel. Happen to be in town. So Nvidia is a company that some of you may or may not know. We have our roots in the PC gaming industry, but in the past 15 years or so, we've moved into the high-performance computing arena. And then about 6 years ago, we, in a number of different settings, bumped into the AI algorithms using our high-performance computing capability, and that led to big breakthroughs in image recognition, speech recognition, and a whole number of areas of narrow AI. And I think we're having a lot of wonderful interactions with industry and with government on the possibilities of this technology. We testified last week at Will Hurd's hearing, and I think that was an opening area for us among other AI hearings. In addition to, I work closely with Dr. Felton on the Future of AI document and Dr. Furman on some of his leadership in the area of what are the economics of this technology. I think bottom line, we have a technology that probably is the one you would pick if you said, what one thing are we going to do for national leadership? You would invest in AI. And then I think we untangle from there, what should we do to be a leader, and then what things do we do to make sure it's safely implemented in various areas. It's happening all around us. I think self-driving cars are going to be one of the test beds of a confidence in the technology. I do think we need to demystify narrow AIs from the Terminator movies and the general AI concepts that artfully our media kingpins have put forth. And I think that may come through the process of something like a self-driving car, and the confidence is there. But AI is happening all around us, and we're living in it. It's when you turn on your phone, many things that you're doing there have been influenced by things in shops like Google and Facebook and others that are absorbing our products and doing magical things with them. So I think the regulatory focus and the government focus should be, what do we have to do to be a leader in this world? We're being challenged externally by other countries that see our R&D complex, our basic research complex, and can see clearly what they would do to take us, and it's an open book test. And I think we should look at what the others are doing and quickly realize we have a jewel in our hands as an American product that we're leading in, and figure out what do we have to do to remain leaders. And I think we'll talk about that, but that's my entree to this.
Definitely. So maybe a great place to start is actually picking up on your comments, Ned. You mentioned R&D, and as we put together this report and as we spoke to folks and looked at some of the work that's been done in this space, that's been a key focus of much of the discussion. What is the U.S. government's role? The U.S. government's role is the long-term R&D piece. So we agreed with that. It was the first area of recommendations in our report, is continuing to support the fundamental research in R&D and fill the gaps where industry is not incentivized to invest.
Right.
So as one of the leading companies in the industry investing in this technology, can you talk a little bit about where you see the value of U.S. government investment in R&D and where you think that industry is doing really well?
I think industry's done really well on the consumer application scenarios, and those are big and obvious, and right now self-driving cars would be one, the mobility industry in general. There's no replacement for basic R&D, and you might argue, in fact, that some of our work in Nvidia being in this space was from a grant from the NSF, working on the area of programming a massively parallel chip, which led us into supercomputers, which led us to confront the big bang of processing power, high performance computing, algorithms, and then big data. The government, the United States government, happens to be the biggest purchasing entity in the world, and has a huge head count and has big data. So between its leadership role in terms of those areas, and it has some of the biggest problems to solve in terms of waste and fraud and abuse and all sorts of services that it renders, set aside the military applications. So I think its position and role in that is unmistakable. It also has the ability to do patient capital, patient investments, and make bets in areas that we can't foresee. And I think many of these grants, we're a big proponent of the National Science Foundation and increased funding there. There's so many chance outcomes that we can't foresee at this point that you need that constant investment. We have a group of companies that we lead in a program called Inception, and we're somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 companies now that are working on AI and doing magical things in the medical industry, the agriculture industry, defense-related things, and just these are outcroppings, and a lot of them are derivatives of investments in basic research. And I think that's an area that other countries envy, and they're trying to duplicate that scenario. And the U.S. leads, and we should double down on that.
May I add to that?
Of course.
So another thing that I would add to the discussion around research and development is that there's been a great deal of investment in advancing machine learning research and algorithmic capabilities. There's less incentive and less investment in looking at the ecosystem within which the technology will be absorbed. So how will workers respond to machines, collaboration with machines, working with machines as part of their jobs? What are some of the interdependencies when you give machine intelligence technologies to soldiers, for example? How does the decision-making process change that surrounds the technology? I think those are really important areas that may be not at the top of the priority list for the private sector to invest in, where the United States government could really offer additional dollars and add a lot of value.
Definitely, and I think I would add one more that we highlighted in the paper and that I think is really important, which is the U.S. government has an opportunity to fund forms of the technology that might be more easily controllable, more transparent, more responsive to some of the ethical questions that have been raised around AI in a way that doesn't limit the ability of the private sector to invest in developing the technology and investing in new and innovative applications of it, but might give them more tools, more technical solutions to some of these problems.
I think an area where there may be an insufficient incentive for investment in the private sector, but one in which government has got a huge interest, is in the question of validation, verification, reliability, how it is that you wind up addressing complex software, interacting with other complex software in a way to have confidence in the outcomes. And at least for some period of time, there may be sort of commonalities of basic research into how to approach those questions. I'm not sure, but I guess I'd ask the question to you guys whether this is an area in which there's a sufficient incentive just in the private sector to engage in that kind of research, or whether it's something that at least at this point would benefit from government funding.
Well, I have lots of opinions, and some of them I'm thinking of right now. I think we should look at the nature of the computing solution is kind of, there's ingredients here. One of the main ingredients that I'm looking to right now is the data scientist. And the data scientist is the maestro who brings all this together. And I think we need to look a lot at things around what does that person do? How are they driving bias out of solutions? How are they ripening these to the outcome that was desired? And that's an area where the human is in control. And in fact, we'll talk a lot about the bias of the system. I think the human controls the input to the system that is going to lead you to that. And in our society, I think data scientists are going to be extremely important to work on that issue. Companies that deploy these kind of products in many arenas generally have high market valuations, and they're very afraid of things going wrong. So I think there's a tremendous incentive to get it right for anybody who's using it for commercial applications. So that incentive exists. But I think the colleges and the research entities, if they can be exploring these human-machine interfaces and beginning to iron out the areas where we need to look further and work on, I think that's the area where we struggle a bit. We're really good at building computers that accomplish problems. We're a problem-solving entity. And AI is a tool. It's an augmentation of a human in certain areas. But humans still control it, and the data scientists, I think, are going to be a critical factor in how we really make sure these things are done well in society and people have confidence. The companies are incentivized, though, to get it right.
If I could just add one more question, really. One of the really striking features of the report was its discussion of government participation in both national and international standard setting, best practices, sort of common standards, partly just to integrate all of this stuff to get to the point of adoption rather than innovation, but also from the standpoint of all these other concerns about safety and various ethical issues that arise out of that. I thought that was one of the best discussions I'd seen, and think that that certainly needs to get kind of a wider hearing.
Mm-hmm. If I were to add one more thing on this topic, I think the relationship between the private sector and the public sector in terms of the types of research that is being performed today. We'll talk about later in the report the concept of opening up data, making it available for research, but also incentivizing a collaboration between the two sectors in terms of sharing the findings, sharing the outcomes, so that we can really and truly advance the state of the art in terms of the technology, whether it's high performance computing, quantum computing, what have you. I think that there's an opportunity there that we could actually improve upon.
Definitely. And I think that ties in neatly with another topic that we touched on very heavily in the report. But in this area of adoption, one of the interesting tensions that we wanted to investigate in this study was, in many cases, you have MI beginning to infiltrate heavily regulated industries. And in some cases, you find it running into regulations that predated the technology, and the regulations are actually constraining the development, deployment, innovation in the space. But on the other hand, we did want to make sure that regulators are thinking about the legitimate risks, and that there is a balance between managing legitimate risks, particularly to safety, civil rights, the key areas where the government has a mandate to protect the public, and the desire to support innovation. And I know that, Ken, you have been very involved in a lot of these debates in the self-driving car space, which is certainly one of the most kind of present examples of this trade-off. So can you talk a little bit about that balance?
Yeah, I guess part of the question of how to balance the legitimate regulatory role in these kind of public values that are always been there, not going to go away, but are going to have to get expressed in relation to new technological things that come out of this. One of the questions is going to be, if you're a regulator, is the right approach to attempt to regulate the technologies in a way that comes very close to actually picking the winners and the losers? Or instead, is it to wind up adopting the approach of trying to simply regulate the effects? So in other words, if you're talking about all these different self-driving car technologies, should the Department of Transportation be in the position of saying, this one we like, that one we don't, or simply saying it has to meet certain kind of standards of safety at the end of the day, and we'll kind of measure it that way? Now, the Department of Transportation, and I would say the general approach in the self-driving car space, has been to go for the effects and to be very, very unwilling to kind of do anything that picks directly or indirectly technological winners from losers, which is not the case when it comes to safety regulation in many other parts of motor vehicles. So for example, DOT has no problem saying that if you're talking about airbags, the explosive charge has to be this, it can't be more than this, and it's not just a question of, okay, make sure nobody gets killed. So I guess I'd say that the effects-based and voluntary nature of the regulation at this point strikes me as exactly the right approach in terms of where we are, in terms of knowledge about the actual technologies doing it. But I think at some point there will be kind of emerging pictures of which technologies for certain purposes work better than others, and there will be more direct regulation of them.
Maybe, Ned, I wanted to follow up on a conversation we had earlier about the difficulties as a regulator or as someone who is overseeing these technologies of recognizing what happens at what parts of the AI tech stack and where the right point is for intervention. So Nvidia, you guys are enmeshed in the technology from top to bottom, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, how regulators should think about the different types of problems and where in the technology they should be thinking about finding solutions.
Yeah, and I think I'll give an answer that is related to current events. And we've been in a number of hearings with Chairman Hurd recently. At CES, I hosted Elaine Chao in our booth, who came by and looked at many things, in addition to Congressman Issa and others. And the one area that we tend to look at is driven miles and simulated miles. And I think NVIDIA is a company that's involved with now 320 companies around the world working on level 3, 4, 5 automation, and with our Drive PX and our Pegasus platform. We're in a dance with the regulators, Nat Buse and his team, the NHTSA group, and working through a driven mile and a simulated mile demonstration of how this is going to get to the point where it's proven to be safe enough to go out in the public. And so our current approach is to work closely with them and let them understand where we're at and to constantly go through these proof points along the way. This year is a very interesting year because the platforms that we have, Drive PX and the Pegasus platform, are in a mode where we're in a pre-production mode. We're doing driven miles and then going into a simulator, and our simulator that I showed at CES can do 60,000 miles in an hour and the whole US road system in a day. And we can move around clouds. I joke that we can bring a dinosaur in and have it run around. We can do all the corner cases that we can do because we have a lot of experience in PC gaming and physics and reality. And so that's a huge advantage. And I think most of the AIs that I see, they need to start out with something that's a product that can then ripen. And this is a product that is ripening through volumes of miles being driven everywhere. In the simulation scenario, that is the proof point or the case where automakers can have that technology and begin to have the ability to do a change and then see through a simulation how it would work throughout the system before they would deploy it. Because you don't want like a PC scenario where you're introducing changes that could have problems in corners. You have to be able to test it. If there's an accident or a scenario, we can figure out where it was introduced. And I think that simulation technology is a little bit of an aha. And everybody who saw that wanted to lean into that. And I think that's an area that can be applied to many other areas. We're using it in our robotics development because robots are a different challenge. They have to figure out touch points. They don't just avoid touching something. They actually touch it and have to not crush it and pick up things and do unique things. And each scenario is a combination of narrow AIs that we have to think through. And simulators are a great way to advance something from a basic level, the baby, I guess you would call it, up to something that is worth going to production with or to market with. So I think it's a dance with the regulators. I think we need to make sure that they understand where we're going, and I think the proficiency will stage down many concerns. We may get to a few areas where they have to be prescriptive, and I think we're learning that together.
So another key area of the report, and really something that in many ways I think will be a make or break issue for the US government in this technology, is people. That's something that's come up today a couple of times, but really something that we wanted to very much emphasize in this report. The lack of talent is the number one reason cited by enterprises for why they haven't adopted this technology. But it's also one of the key things that is holding back the development of new technologies in this space. And it's one of the biggest fears that I think that political leaders and government officials are going to have to manage among the public. What will happen to jobs? How will I develop the skills that I need? And Emma, I know that we've talked about this at length. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the view that we outlined in the report on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So, it's said often, but it bears repeating that investment in STEM education is incredibly important, starting at the earliest grade levels. I think a point that maybe is discussed less often is, STEM education doesn't necessarily mean that we need every high school graduate or college graduate to be a computer science expert and a data scientist. There's an element of creating interdisciplinary education that brings knowledge and understanding of the technology even at a higher level where you might not be the creator of the technology, and couple that with understanding of some of the other fields that have a really important impact for the technology: psychology, human-machine interface, social implications of the technology. It's really important that the United States invest not only in the science and technology education, but also in creating people who are understanding of the technology to the extent that it allows them, to the point that's been made several times, to be optimistic about it. Something that this group, as we were preparing for this discussion today, talked about was the fact that in other parts of the world, students are incredibly excited about robotics and machine intelligence and machine learning technologies. They think it's very cool. There's a huge amount of possibility. It's the #1 field that they could be in. I think the narrative sometimes for us here in the United States has been too focused on some risks that may be exaggerated, and that's blurred our ability to imbue in our students a real passion for the technology. I think one of the first steps, STEM education, again, incredibly important and a complex policy issue to tackle, but something that might be easier is how do we get the higher level understanding of the technology that allows people to be excited and enthusiastic about it? How can we start from that place and move into some of the more complex problems around ensuring that we're able to really educate people on the science and math better, further into that effort?
I think another piece that we emphasized in the paper is you have the STEM piece and the need to, I think we framed it as some basic level of digital literacy, an understanding of machines, an understanding of the degree of supposed intelligence that these machines have, which often isn't very intelligent. It needs to be a part of the basic toolkit that every kid is developing from early in their life, just like arithmetic and reading and writing, because you're going to be living in a digital world where digital is part of everything else that you do. And also, I have to put in the plug. Emma mentioned the interdisciplinary studies. My mother works in liberal arts education, and she will be shocked and wonderfully pleased to hear me say, I think that's really the future for many students. The hard skills, the STEM skills, are not very resilient to automation. Many of them are things that are actually relatively easy to replace with a machine. But communications, an understanding of context, the soft skills that are developed by an interdisciplinary approach and an emphasis not only on the science, technology, and math, but also on cultural studies will be very important for people who work with machines down the line. But the last piece is the importance of support for workers in transition. The AI jobs apocalypse narrative is less about we won't have the right people in 20 years to do these jobs and more about what will happen to the people who are in their 40s who can't find jobs anymore because they lack the skills, they lack the training, they lack the education. And I think this is an area where the US government can do a lot. Providing support to workers in transition, finding ways to give them options, to allow them to take time out of the workforce, to build those skills, to get new education. That's another piece that we think is really important. And the universal basic income discussion, it's probably a little early to go down that road, but we think it's a discussion that will eventually happen. But in the meantime, what can the US government do to support workers in transition, to provide those mechanisms, those opportunities for them to reskill? That's another key thing that we talked about in this.
If I could add just quickly, I think there are tons of opportunities out there for upskilling the workforce. Free online courses in machine learning, deep learning, high performance computing type of technologies. Nvidia's got things like the Deep Learning Institute, where making it available, making the skills and that tool set available to as many people as possible, I think is critical. And I think that's where the government can also play a role in encouraging the state and local governments to really embed this new type of technology into the schools, into their teacher curriculums, and make sure that they're also upskilling the teachers that are engaged in the K-12 STEM programs that exist today.
Yeah, I would note or add that in the discussions over the years that I've had, and in this I might center around a presentation by Dr. Furman, who is the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, July 7th at NYU. So he talked a lot about the nature of AI, and we can't get enough of it in our economy. But he also pointed to some of the policy considerations that we need to think about. And I think what we've been seeing over a period of decades is we have had transitional displacements in our economy. And this new period that we're coming up on is only different in that maybe the pace might increase and there may be some more disruptions that happen rapidly. In all that, I am extremely optimistic of what I see. There's an incredible world that's unfolding of new jobs, new opportunities, new scenarios for many different disciplines. And that's extremely exciting. I do think our economy has suffered previously and continues to through this problem of when somebody is in transition, how do they shuffle over to new roles? And it pushes us back to our pre-K through 12 education, the ability to learn continuously throughout their life, and then also basics in terms of what is the technology of the world that they're living in. So not everybody will be a data scientist, a master's or PhD level guy making a ton of money. It's a great job, but they need to live in that world. I think the government can play a great role in having things where they incentivize companies to do apprenticeships. Instead of unemployment, why don't we incentivize apprenticeships? Companies a lot of times are the fast path. And I think even though we have community college systems and things, those need to be organized and pull off companies who are then using the community colleges to train guys that they've already given a job to. I think as an economic unit, a person who has a job is a very different kind of citizen. And we need to try as fast as we can to pull people from older economies or displaced economies into these new economies. And the case evidence I see of these thousands of startups that are following us, I see a brilliant world of amazing breakthroughs and changes with some disruptions. And I see exciting opportunities in areas where fields where people might worry about them, and they're excitedly moving on. Take the radiologists. There's going to be a lot of disruption in that field, but they know how much better this technology can make their field and around the world. And so they're leaning into it. And we see people go from a bit of consternation, but then they lean into it and they figure out how to live in this new world. And it's very exciting to see that. We do a lot of training around the world, and you'll see at our conferences. We have a thing called Deep Learning Institute, and we're also working on accreditation and certification programs. And we're being contacted by governors and other offices trying to copy that in their college curriculums and create certification scenarios where people can come out the door and, for example, with our Drive PX platform, they're immediately employable if they've been working on these platforms. And I see a lot of scenarios to stitch people into the economy, in this new economy, high-paying jobs that are quite valuable, and scenarios for the government to provide that transitional buffer, not just unemployment, which is a kind of a current basic income. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think to build on some of the points that have been made, I think when we talk about workers in transition, there's this, it can feel weighted or heavy. How do we corral the past into the future and fit people who are doing an outmoded version of work into something new? And I think that there's a much more positive aspect to it. There are ways that we envision our careers today. There are ways that we think about our education, a 4-year college degree, a really static long-term career, a work week that's 40 hours long. There's an opportunity at this very moment to reevaluate those things and try to envision what is the next step, what is the future, how might we work in a larger diversity of jobs over our careers in the future. Could we have a shorter work week, something I think we would all enjoy. There's a huge amount of creativity that could be put into thinking about what the future is. It doesn't need to be a negative thing. There's lots of possibility, and I think the government and policymakers are in a unique position to explore what those options are and look beyond some of the ones that are often repeated around basic income and worker transition programs to think, what are the creative options for what work and education look like into the future?
Yeah. Can I just add 2 points building on both of what's been said across? One, going, Will, back to your earlier point about your mother would be pleased to hear you say that liberal studies and these kinds of things. I think that's absolutely true, in part because this is engineering. This is stuff which is looking to build tools that in some way are useful to us, and it's pretty hard to know what those tools are and how they should be configured unless you've got some idea about what we want. And that itself is not science or engineering or STEM, it's all this other stuff. And I think that the ability to interface with these technologies, because not everybody's going to be the data scientist, as you said. I once, back in law school, followed my then girlfriend across to the business school and took a course in finance for the non-financial manager. And In other words, it was designed to teach enough about finance and basic finance math and techniques in order that somebody in a managerial role could be able to sort of bridge those gaps. And it seems to me, in a way, what you guys are talking about in the report is the notion that we need to find ways to educate people to those roles. And if I were to talk as a university professor, I'd say some of the biggest barriers to that in terms of how we do higher education especially is if you were the School of Engineering in most institutions, especially the higher up the academic ladder you go, you don't really have any interest in educating students from the rest of the departments and the rest of the campus in exactly this kind of thing. Your reputation rests not really even on the engineering students you have, but as one engineering dean told me one time, our reputation really rests on the top 10%. And those are the people on whom we'd like to shower the resources. That's exactly the wrong attitude from the standpoint of producing a sort of broadly educated group of folks that can interface in those kinds of ways. And then the other thing on the employment issue is Tyler Cowen, the economist down at George Mason, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Average is Over. And in the opening chapter, it was kind of written as a letter to his daughter in college at the time, and he said, here are the choices. Into the future, you can be somebody who takes the machine and uses the machine to leverage your own output. And you can do great doing that. Option 2 is you can be somebody who basically leverages the machine's output by being the person that understands the machine, keeps the machine in repair, pushes it to kind of the next level, and you can do spectacularly in that. Where you don't want to be is in the position that you don't really have a relationship to the machine except as a consumer, in which case you're going to be playing a lot of video games, but you won't be sort of doing something more than that. And I think that those three categories are useful ways about thinking about the future in terms of what it means for displacement of work.
Yeah, I got to enthusiastically add to Ken's observations. So great job. I don't see a world where everybody becomes an engineer and a data scientist, and I don't think that'd be a great world. I have an engineering background, but the art is a lot of what we like in our life. I would say the artists, the non-engineers, and we'll put everybody in the who's a non-engineer, are going to be using these augmented skill sets. It is not correct for our whole society to not understand the augmented skill sets that they're growing up with. The artists, the non-engineers, will be directing, using, and productively deploying these in their lives. But they ought to have a sense for that. And I think we take for granted. We do raise our kids currently with a sense for things that we thought in yesteryear that we needed to learn. Our current educational system tries to teach you that, and we ripen, and if you start to use technical language about our own kids, we as humans inference our way through life to begin to deal with things that are common around us. We take that for granted, that our system teaches us that. What we're talking about, I think, is that part of the research that needs to be done, and the thing that we need to lean into at a national level, is the ability to embrace it as a society, learn it, and know how to use it. And not everybody will be the engineer or the data scientist, and that's okay. There'll be a ton of great jobs that pay a lot of money in those fields. Some may want to do it just because of that, but they'll be fascinating. It'll be fascinating to find out all the things that AI does that we can't think of, steered by people who are not AI scientists. And that's going to be a really explosive area. That may be the biggest area we haven't actually seen.
But I think that gets to ultimately one of the key conclusions that we hope that everyone will take away from this report, which is I think the real leverage of this technology is going to be how it transforms every other part of the economy and every other part of our lives. As much as, certainly the Googles, the Nvidias, the tech companies are going to be a huge engine of growth going forward. They're also going to provide a new engine of growth to traditional industries, new ways of doing everything that we've done conventionally with our analog means for hundreds of years. And hopefully, as Emma mentioned, that will lead to more leisure, more opportunity for everyone. I always love the stat that over the course of the 20th century, as the American economy transformed completely, 100%, almost everyone's job changed in a fundamental way. The number of people who took vacation every year went from 7% to over 80%. And as I hope many of us here are in that 80%, we can maybe push it to 100 and maybe start talking about 2 vacations a year. So, but with that, I'd like to give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. Please phrase your question in terms of a question. We run into trouble with that at think tank events. But we have some folks with microphones that'll be coming to you. Please stand up, state your name and your affiliation, and then ask your question. Right there.
Hi, good morning. Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst in DC with some places. One quick fact and then a question. I read recently in War magazine that the government of Denmark has assigned an ambassador to Silicon Valley. His name is Kasper Klinge, and he's known as a technoplat. And he's the first one, apparently, of his kind. I was wondering, what do you think is going to be the future of relations between governments and the IT industry? Is there like a liaison of Cybercom in Silicon Valley talking to these IT industries directly? And you think other countries are going to assign ambassadors specifically for Silicon Valley or other rising IT hubs, like in India, for example? Thank you.
Anyone?
I think I'll give a brief remark and then turn it over to the expert on this particular topic. But I think it is going to be very interesting to see the enhancement of international collaboration and cooperation around machine intelligence technologies. You see in Europe in particular a lot of efforts to collaborate across borders around policy. Of course, there's a proximity issue there that drives some of that conversation, but I think in the future we're going to see an increase in the need for governments to cooperate and collaborate in the development of policy around the technology.
I'll also add that you're already starting to see our government take advantage of Silicon Valley through organizations like DIUX and other startups and communities that give the government access and insight into what that startup community is actually developing and thinking about. There's also other methods and forms that the government's engaging with industry through things like CRADAs and OTAs, and those are awesome examples of how you can increase the communication and the transference of information and understanding between the two entities. So we're going to see a lot more of that, I think.
So I haven't met this guy, so I want to know. So, I think humans in groups tend to find somebody to go and meet with another group, and so we will see around the world groups, task forces, et cetera. And I think the natural collection of individuals will start to occur in groups within the different countries that are leaders in this area. And I think our government will do a lot of task forces where they bring in centralized groups of people that are loosely bolted, but they provide a central resource. Because the technology is a little bit new and exotic, your experts don't exist everywhere, and that provides a framework for others to pull on that knowledge. And I can see logically that they would then extend that out to other aligned countries and connect for best practices, for access to information, et cetera. We connect to those as best we can, and we're open with our products and technologies, and I think that's a good process right now because it demystifies a lot of things. And even in sophisticated organizations, people aren't caught up on things like deep learning narrow AI versus general AI, and just basic concepts that we're talking about the whole society should know are not even in some of the organizations you would think might know that.
I will put in a plug. The ambassador is going to actually be on a panel that I'll be leading at the Global Development Forum at CSIS in April. Come check that out. It's on AI and development, so encourage you to join us for that. But I think there are 2 quick points I would add to this. One is, I think part of the reason that you're starting to see this direct outreach from governments around the world to the tech industry is because there's a recognition that this technology has so much potential, but that poorly crafted policy could be detrimental to the development of the technology and to all of its benefits. So I actually think that it's a really good sign that there's a recognition that this policy can be industry-led and that there can be collaboration between governments and industry leaders in developing it. The other piece is, yes, governments are sending people to Silicon Valley, but we're also, thankfully, starting to see some companies sending their AI experts to DC. Ned being one of them. But there's starting to be a community developing here. There's starting to be a community developing in Brussels, in Beijing, and other places, having these policy conversations. And governments are going to build the framework, the standards, governance, collaboration frameworks in which this technology will develop and in which will operate. But I'm actually really encouraged that they're seeing this as an effort that needs to be industry-led and industry-informed. Yep.
Hi, I'm Itai Binan from Securing America's Future Energy. So I wanted to drill down a little bit about the role of government in R&D and specifically talk about some of the federal infrastructure for research and development. We have now hundreds of federal labs, including 40 federally funded research and development centers. So what, in the context of the report you've written, what is the best way to leverage this pretty considerable investment in federal research capacity to advance machine learning?
Who wants to go first?
Well, we do have this hearing series, which after, Will and I, Congressman Hurd and I had a good discussion. He launched this series. I think I might have influenced that. The second hearing is on March 7th, and they will bring in agencies and ask them, how are you going to implement AI? Now, it's not every group of the government, but the GSA, the DOD, the DOE, NSF, a number of them, to talk about what are we doing to implement AI? What are the plans? What should we be doing? And I think those are very healthy conversations. And I think those will lead us to a lot of interesting observations. And it also causes those entities to begin to think about how they might accomplish that. So I think the government is doing some of the right steps, just getting its mind around what it should be doing. And I see public evidence of that I can point to.
So a couple other areas that we highlight in the report and that I think will be very important. One is supporting the universities who continue to struggle in this area. One of the things that I think is great about funding university research in this area is it not only gets you that research and development, but it also incentivizes more really bright minds to state universities where they educate more really bright minds, which I think is very important. Another piece that we touch on is the ARPAs, the DIUXs, the InQTELs. I think that's another really important way that government can support innovation in the commercial sector. And one thing that I think is a really good model that has been successful in the past, particularly in areas like this where you want there to be a lot of experimentation and a lot of different approaches attempted, is the prize model. There's been some really, really interesting successes where the government put out a prize, whoever can do the best at a particular technological task. And I think that that's a model that could be really interesting. But one thing that we kind of came to is all of this represents a relatively small piece of the government's budget, both the research funding and the procurement side. And I think we are expecting this tiny piece of the budget, this tiny piece of the organs of government to generate the bulk of our next generation of capabilities. And I think that given the importance that we attach to the outputs of all of these different mechanisms, we have to also give them the inputs, fund them at an appropriate level that corresponds to the value that we see coming from these technologies.
Thanks. Jacob Markish at Thales. Clearly, there's lots of applications of AI that are dual use, from commercial sectors to defense, national security. Conv nets that can recognize cats can be used to do target recognition, autonomy algorithms for UAV navigation. How have you seen the government to date think about the munitions list, the ITAR regulatory framework, and the national security constraint framework evolve relative to AI? And how do you see it going forward? What do we need to do in order to, on one hand, protect technologies where we need to, on the other hand, prevent a situation where there's a sort of walled garden of DoD research that is separate and falling behind commercial grade AI research?
Well, I'll give kind of a sort of an answer back to the extent that I can think through the question. I think the challenge we'll have moving forward is the U.S. leads in this technology. The U.S. has many implementations that are the breaking, the leading edge of it. Reflexively, the U.S. government might want to restrict sale of underpinning technologies to other markets, which in the commercial market, the challenge will be you'll begin to pull your U.S. companies back from a market, say China, for example, where then it reduces the R&D budgets and the throw forward of U.S. companies in these areas. So I think we have to struggle hard with what is the leading edge and what is the leading edge all about. And a lot of it is the application and the software and the data scientists that work. And sometimes we might reflexively do some things that are counterproductive. And we're still thinking about these things and working through it. But working with these groups and I think usually the way these things work out, knowledge it knocks down a lot of barriers. And I think we need to understand, demystify and get into the narrow AI applications and where they might be utilized, and understand the U.S. leadership role. And a lot of our leadership role is actually being a leader, and the U.S. government being that entity that can drive so much ripening and adoption of these technologies. If we pause and hold too long and get reflexively restrictive, we will create a scenario where we've taken a leadership position and dropped behind.
I'd also add that I think in terms of some of the defense and intelligence type of applications, there's been an acceleration of interest in actual exploration of these technologies through things like algorithmic warfare efforts and Project Maven that's going on currently within the Defense Department. These technologies, and these organizations are certainly taking a look at what exists in the commercial sector and how it applies into the defense missions. So that communication, that collaboration, I think exists and is currently happening through things like DIUX, through challenge-based defense like the organizations like Kaggle run. So we're starting to see a lot more pull through in terms of what capabilities get introduced into the Defense Department.
If I could, in another part of my life, I do a lot of stuff related to law of war, law of weapons, things like that, including automation of weapons and that area. One of the things that's long struck me about the U.S. national security community inside government is just how heterogeneous where different parts of that are in terms of their sophistication, say NSF versus, say, the FBI. And that's also true within DoD itself. There are areas in which the U.S. military is able to bring to the sort of cutting edge AI research and technologies a wealth of information that it's developed over the very long term about such things as what specific application do we want for a weapon, for example. And I think one part of that is simply if you're talking about things that are very specific to the military that are not sort of so much dual use as you said at the beginning, the military actually knows more about what they want than anything else. The other area that I think much of the rest of the community could learn from at least the U.S. military is a deeper understanding than most places I've seen about the psychological interplay of the human-machine interface. And because it's critical to the lawyers, it's critical to the strategic mission that you be able to put force where you want to be able to put it and not someplace else. And so much of the sort of view within military weapons design and things like that has understood far faster than many other aspects of the industry that this is going to be a dyad relationship. It's not the machine, it's the machine-human, it's the user of the machine in the field, it's the operator. Is that operator trained to be able to use it in various ways? All of those questions. And whoever is programming the rules of engagement and whoever the original designer is. I think there's a lot of places in the world where they could learn from the fact that the US military involves lawyers at the very inception of the design process, and for very selfish reasons. They don't want to wind up spending a couple $2 billion on some weapon system and have the Pentagon lawyers tell them that it's just illegal. So the idea of being focused on the machine-human interface as being at the center of it, I think, is an area where the US military at least is ahead of most organizations.
I would build on that with one additional piece. I think best case scenario, even if we were to accept that the US is unequivocally leading in all of the most important dual use technologies, I think best case scenario, we would keep our adversaries a few generations behind. But a few generations older technology in this space, better used, will still beat us, even if our tech is better. So instead of focusing on preventing others from getting the technology, it's figuring out how to actually leverage this technology effectively within our military that I think is most important. The other piece is, I don't think that that initial assumption is valid, that we can just say that the US has unequivocal leadership in all of the key technologies here. And so, for example, you think about the SlaughterBots video, right? First off, the fact that that professor was able to build his little SlaughterBot from open source material tells me that that ship has sailed. And if an adversary really wants to do it enough, they'll figure out how to do it because he was able to. But the second piece is, if we're going to control drone technology, well, the largest drone company in the world is actually a Chinese company. Facial recognition, some of the most successful startups in the world are actually based in China. Autopilot, again, Thales is one of the biggest providers of autopilot and avionics in the world. You guys focus on the large planes, but I just mean to say that there's no one place where you could build the wall around it and keep all of the core technologies in. They're all over the place, and we want to make sure that they're flowing freely and that everyone is leveraging them as best they can. So.
If I may, that was actually the motivation for my question, which is, in my experience talking to folks in the national security world, it is definitely not the case that the U.S. has a monopoly on leadership and technology.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I know we have more questions, but we are running out of time, and I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to give a final statement, highlight anything you think we might have missed, but maybe one thing you could each include in your comment. We talked about putting a positive narrative on this and around looking around the corner at the potential of this technology. In your final comment, maybe you can highlight what you think is most exciting around the corner, or what you most look forward to.
Shall I start?
Emma, go ahead.
All right, perfect. So I think one issue that we didn't cover in any great depth is the importance of exploring some of the ethical implications of the technology. And one issue that's near and dear to my heart that I think government and policymakers have a role to play in is ensuring that we diversify and broaden the number and type of people who are involved in not only the direct development of the technology, but in thinking through how it's applied, who's using it. I think we need a greater diversity of thought and voices in guiding the application of the technology. So that's one thing we didn't cover that I wanted to mention. And on the note of what makes me excited about the technology, I think I'll give just one personal example of a category of application that makes me really excited. I think the work that's being done around applying machine intelligence technologies to the environment is really inspiring. There's a great opportunity for us to use pesticides more wisely, to undertake conservation with greater precision and accuracy, and I think those applications are really exciting and something that we should invest in advancing really quickly.
Ken?
So starting with the question about what excites me about these areas, I've somewhat surprised myself to discover that what most excites me in these areas turn out to be the emergence of granular applications like the things you just mentioned, self-driving vehicles, ways in which this stuff can be applied in agriculture, and that in a sense it feels more exciting to me as it comes down to brass tacks, so to speak, and specific applications in specific domains. and that seems to be more exciting, and it's also a whole lot more real. And so on the other side of that, it seems to me that we need to de-enchant, demystify, as Ned said, but sort of de-enchant the sort of understanding of AI, probably by starting by getting rid of the term AI itself. And we've now sort of broken it down into many much more discrete technologies, not just applications, but actual technologies and approaches. And even the term artificial intelligence is something that tends to mystify just in its own nature, because the term intelligence is something that's inherently ambiguous as between the piling up of computational capacity versus how we actually think of intelligence, which is as connected to the will, to intention, to consciousness, all of those things. So I think that a demystification of the field and a focus on the garden in front of us, or the multiple gardens, would be both a useful thing, and it's certainly what most excites me.
So you bring up a good point. I mean, part of the title of our report actually uses the term machine intelligence, so we put a lot of thought into that lexicon. We've talked to a number of organizations and clients out there, and when we bring up artificial intelligence, there's a natural reaction that is not necessarily a positive. When we framed the conversation with those clients and those different organizational leaders and said, hey, would you be more willing to have a machine help you do that? There was a lot more positive reception, which is why we like to use the term machine intelligence when we talk about this technology. That said, the thing that excites me the most, and I'm really excited to see in the future, is how organizations start adopting and shifting towards a more native machine intelligent type of organization, where these technologies are enabling the processes, taking advantage of the data, where we're starting to see a significant increase in collaboration between ingenious humans and intelligent machines. That future is what really excites me.
Gosh, there's so many places. I was listening to people, and there's a number of areas, though, that every day wake me up, and I am so fortunate to work at Nvidia because we're at the epicenter of dealing with so many. I look at medicine, and there's so many places where, for my lifetime, I've thought we were going to fix something or we were going to make progress on something, and I can really see these tools and skill sets being used in ways that I think in the next few years you'll hear stories of dramatic breakthroughs in looking at scans, maybe finding cancers years before we found them, ways to look at all sorts of medical technologies that we currently think are state-of-the-art, and redoing that, bringing down costs, improving services, and services that can be distributed throughout the world. And we may even see in other economies, second world economies, utilization of some things like a picture of your eye, and all of a sudden a quick report comes back from the cloud and about any issues that you might have. Those are wonderful uses of AI. The other thing is in the mobility sector. Transportation is a huge industry for us, 10 trillion a year or something like that. It's gigantic. And I think we take for granted in this last 100 years how much we've allowed that to shape our lives completely in one sense. But think of the young and the old and the people with disabilities, the franchisement of those people into the economy and into so many places that is not occurring right now. There's a lot of barriers that are going to be dropping rapidly, and I think that's a wonderful change in our lives, and just the productivity of people that then are not sitting in traffic jams just think your job for several hours is to stop and start. Computers can do that pretty well. And I think we take for granted. AI will be touching us in a number of different areas, and I think there's many, many, many beautiful advances that we're going to relish as a society. We won't want to give those back. And in addition to dealing with any of the dislocations and all the bad things people think of, I get really excited about the positives.
All right. For my exciting thing, building off of Ned a little bit, I'm most excited about the opportunities that this will present for people to relate better. If human error can be taken out of a lot of processes, we may yell at less clerks and other service people. If we are given an opportunity to have more leisure in our lives, we may enjoy each other more. If AI can be used to give people access to education, to cultural experiences, to tools, to economic opportunity that they haven't had before, I'm actually I think we have this narrative where it'll end up dividing us all and we'll all sit in our apartments and they won't even have doors anymore because it'll basically be a matrix pod. But I think it actually has the potential to do the opposite. More culture, more art, more opportunity for human interaction. And I'm really excited about that myself. So, but that will come down ultimately to a lot of policy decisions that we need to make. And the start of that is having a strategy in our country, is partnering with others, is building that out globally, and hopefully capturing a lot of these positive benefits of the technology. So with that, we'll close. Please join me in thanking Booz Allen and our fellow panelists for all of their great work.